So one of the ways that you will inevitably have to adapt, or something that you will have to consider and prepare for, is franchisees struggling. I just want to say that franchisees leaving is not necessarily a sign of failure on your part. As we all saw with COVID this year, bad things happen. And the bigger you grow, the more you'll have to deal with the reality that some franchisees, unfortunately, will struggle and will fail. So we want to make sure that you are as prepared as possible for that inevitable event. In fact, you can look at it as the more successful that you get, the more likely you are to have at least some bad experience with a franchisee. I hate to say it, but it's good to just expect that at the outset. So first, we always recommend, and you will want to try to help the struggling franchisees. So we want to make sure that you are equipped to do that. One of the things to think about when you are considering how to help your struggling franchisees is, do you have the mechanisms in place to even know that they're struggling? One thing to think about is what kinds of metrics in your system are going to indicate that there's some sort of problem with the franchisee. Is a decline in royalties going to be the first indicator? Are bad customer reviews going to be a first indicator? What are the metrics that are really going to show you as a franchisor that a franchisee is struggling? And whatever that metric is, we'd recommend that you capture it quickly, that you get that data consistently, and that you are able to react systematically and consistently when you see trouble. One thing to think about too with those royalties is, are you accepting those royalties at an interval that is going to allow you to react quickly enough? Oftentimes when franchisors are just starting out, they want to collect royalties at about a monthly interval because it keeps things fairly simple. The problem with that is, by the time that you realize that your franchisees are struggling from a royalties perspective, it may be 2-3 months into their struggle, and it may be hard to right the ship at that point. The other thing is, when you're starting to see some sign of struggle, do you have consistent policies for dealing with those struggling franchisees? Or are these solutions created ad hoc or applied discriminatorily? So do you have a consistent practice of granting discounts? Is that something that would make sense in your system? Do you have a system in place for sending somebody from the field out to visit the franchisee? Do you have a training process in place? These are all things to think about, and again, things to think about from a legal perspective that you may want to build into your franchise agreements and your policies and procedures. And if you have granted franchisees concessions, this is a really important one from our point of view. If you have granted concessions, do you have a special circumstances agreement that they sign? So if any of you were to give a franchisee, let's say you give them a discount on their royalties, do you have an agreement that an agreement in writing that you have them sign, or is that something that's just done casually over the phone? Unfortunately, we've seen that a lot of times it's the latter. The benefit of having a special concessions agreement, or what we often call a special circumstances agreement, is that it's a great time to get a release from the franchisee, which will release you from liability related to all events that occur, prior to that instance or that signing. And also, the other benefit is just that it's in writing. So you want to have it very clear that this is a short, limited duration concession, that this is not the kind of thing that they now have a right to for the duration of their franchise term. The question was great. It was, if a concession is granted, does it need to be disclosed in next year's FDD? The answer is it depends. If the concession is a monetary concession, if there's a deviation from any of the fees listed in items 5, 6, or 7 of the FDD, then it would need to be disclosed in next year's FDD. If, however, it was a different kind of concession, if you were to make some sort of territorial change. So there are different types of concessions that don't need to be, but a monetary one in items 5, 6, or 7 do need to be disclosed. So that's something to consider. And that's why you want to have policies that you've thought about before these situations, ideally before these situations arise, so that you can be consistent, so that you have a consistent program and story to tell your franchisees, so that there's not inconsistency that breeds entitlement within a franchise system. All right, so sometimes helping doesn't work, unfortunately. So when helping doesn't work, are you documenting your defaults? Are you keeping thorough records of what the franchisees are doing that may warrant a termination if it looks like termination might be the only viable option? And by documenting, are you doing this ideally with photographs? Are you doing it by sending somebody to secret shop their store if it's a retail business? Are you starting to are you sending in writing complaints to them if your team is corresponding with them? Are you careful about what your team says to struggling franchisees? This is where really training your brand or your corporate team to be consistent on their messaging is very important. You want to make sure that they are not promising the franchisees anything or granting concessions without your knowledge. Do you have a policy for implementing fines? Are there any? Does anybody want to speak to? Does anyone have a policy of implementing fines in here, or have they ever seen that work? Yes.
Well, yes and no. I've seen it work because in the previous business I was in Jeffro, we had those. But I will tell you that when we did the first private equity deal, one of the things that they were amazed about was that Jeffro had had litigation. We stayed ahead of time, inside the control of the right from the beginning, and made sure that, for example, there was a problem I could send in training, giving them money to eliminate that problem. If it happened later, we would have a system where we would help them exit out before there's money to sell. Caught it early, help them sell, let them keep their money, get out, put a new person back in.
That's excellent. Yes. So that's exactly what we're talking about, is coming up with that sort of exit strategy. So he was saying, for the benefit of the camera, he was saying that at JanPro, they were able to avoid litigation by really thinking through and consistently implementing a plan for getting their franchisees who are struggling out as quickly and as seamlessly and as kindly as possible. Because that really is the goal. I know as lawyers we can sometimes seem like the bad guys and all doom and gloom, but we know that ultimately we all want what's best for your franchisees as well. And oftentimes what's best for everyone is an exit.
It's important to note that if it goes to litigation, it's a lose-lose for everybody other than the lawyers, right? They're the only people who benefit. So there's capital that's being destroyed, if you will, in legal fees that can be used to try to compose a resolution to the matter if you deal with it early on. And that may involve spending a little bit more early on lawyers than you wanted to spend in the pre-litigation stage, but trying to get that communication to happen and mediation to happen and those kind of things so that the franchisee can be heard and it can be resolved without having to spend an insane amount of money in legal fees in litigation. Because once it goes to litigation, both sides lose control over the resolution, right? Absent a mutual agreement. I mean, you can always mutually agree to get out, but once you're in the litigation or in the arbitration, you're in it till both sides agree to end it or a judge ends it for you.
Correct. So one mechanism, going back to fines, one mechanism that some brands will choose to use once defaults start occurring is rather than formally defaulting a franchisee and sending a scary default notice, sometimes they will implement fines. This can have obviously a deterrent effect, but can be a way of acting in a less severe manner than sending a formal default notice. It's something that if you are interested in implementing, you do need to think through it proactively because it needs to be disclosed in your FTD. The This is another thing to be thinking about proactively for you emerging franchisors. Do you have the ability to shut off the franchisee's access to the POS system and to get the data that you need? Your franchise agreement will have that language in it, at least if we've written it. But practically speaking, you do need to make sure that your vendor agreements allow you to step in. And this is where it's worth thinking through if it's better for you to have like the master account with the vendor, or if you don't, you at least need to have all the passwords and information and ability to go in and grab that customer data. Because practically speaking, there are certain things that we put in your franchise agreement that, again, if it gets to litigation, are going to protect you. It's a lot better to deal with these things practically, so that you aren't fighting in court about who owns the customer data. So definitely don't kick your franchisee out of your system that has valuable POS system data or CRM data until you've ensured that you have access to that and can kick them out. The other thing to think about is, do you have the legal and operational ability to step into your franchisee's businesses in the event of death, disability, or default? This is going to be brand specific, whether this is pertinent or not, but if you have the kind of business that you need to keep operating at a specific location or in a specific market, do you have the ability to do so? You'll want to make sure that your franchise agreement allows for some sort of management step-in rights in the event of a default, if this is something that's very important to you, and you'll also need to make sure that you have a team in place that can carry that out.
And on that point, I mean, it's not just on both it and the fines, the goal isn't to try to take over and seize control over their business. In the case of the step-in right, particularly you that are in service brands that maybe that the owner-operator is very integral to the business, is what happens if they die? I mean, that business you're helping their estate to be able to step in to help keep it alive long enough for them to be able to get a new manager in there or to be able to sell it. But if we don't have that right, you may have a widow spouse that doesn't know what to do, and the business is just going to die from atrophy. And in the case of fines, the goal again is not about the money. It's about getting somebody's attention about that these standards are serious, short of having to terminate their franchise agreement. So whatever methods you can build into your agreement, and each of your systems are different, that allow you to have these circuit breakers that get somebody's attention, short of having to engage in litigation, we view as a good thing, because ultimately, most of the time, that can resolve the matter without having to spend the money on litigation.